Let's get started. Welcome to Similarweb's State of Streaming webinar. Thank you for carving an hour out of your day to spend with us. Hopefully we'll make this a fun and valuable use of everyone's time. So to start, a little bit about me. My name is Jackie Lee, and I'm the head of publishers here at Similarweb. I work closely with our clients in publishing and media on strategies to meet their content development, audience engagement, and revenue goals using our tool. We are also increasingly working with our clients, particularly those that produce video and audio content, on strategies to protect their intellectual property. Prior to joining Similarweb, I was most recently the director of audience at the New York Times. Before we kick this off, I'd actually like to start with a definition of streaming to set the tone of what I'll be covering today. Since there isn't exactly a neutral arbiter of this, I crowdsourced this from our friends at Wikipedia. Streaming media is multimedia that is delivered and consumed in a continuous manner from a source. It refers to the delivery method of content rather than the content itself. This is pretty factually correct, but is it actually useful or actionable when we think about the state of streaming? I am going to use A Star is Born as an example. I did some karaoke last weekend, so this is very top of mind for me. Based on this nugget from Wikipedia, a consumer saying, I'm going to stream A Star is Born could realistically mean a lot of different things. They could be thinking about listening to Shallow on repeat on Spotify. They could mean watching the music video on YouTube, but it could also mean watching the whole movie on Amazon Prime. Or worse for all parties involved, this person could be intending to stream this movie by pirating A Star is Born from a torrent site. My point is, it's challenging to get at a shared understanding of the state of streaming. The industry is fragmented. There isn't a central source of truth, even aligning on a common definition of what we mean by streaming. And there's all these new brands that are entering the market. So the market is constantly being flooded with new content, and everyone is having to grapple with piracy. So with that complexity in mind, I'm going to refocus us specifically on the state of video streaming today. At a high level, I plan to cover the key players in this crowded field. I'll talk about the shift in consumer trends and how COVID has accelerated some of those shifts in consumption behaviors. And then I'll wrap up with some insights into the risks posed by content piracy and how you can use certain data signals to do battle with the most egregious violators. So to start, we know that people are shifting their attention to richer, portable forms of media. And they want the flexibility to choose when and where they consume that content. And as we have established, the industry is working hard to respond in a myriad of ways. We're definitely not the first company to talk about quote unquote streaming wars, but let's make sure we're aligned on who's doing battle here. I thought it would be helpful to start with a timeline of some of the major global streaming video product launches over the last 15-ish years. And I want to draw your attention to the top line. YouTube, Netflix, and Hulu are kind of hanging out in that blank space for a solid half a decade. They had the industry effectively all to themselves. And if we really think about it, they kind of originated, made the industry. So what changed? Well, a couple of things. The first was a growth in high-speed internet access, which helped enable a shift around consumers and customers deciding to quote unquote cut the cord. Another was growth in mobile, particularly in Asia. And I also want to draw your attention to 2013, which is the year that House of Cards premiered. It was Netflix's first original piece of content, and because of Netflix's inherent installed base, it had a wide captive audience. And because Netflix doesn't sell advertising, it meant that Netflix could drop a full season all at once, which kicked off this trend of binge watching. Since then, there's been an acceleration in the launch or relaunch of new video streaming services in the last 4 years. The field is now more crowded than ever, covering many different genres of content. And while there's been some wildly successful launches like Disney Plus to challenge what I think about as the OG3, we also saw Quibi, which launched right when COVID was ramping up and realistically should have done well, to be honest. Instead, it crashed and burned, even though it had plenty of investment, super strong management, and killer star power. So with this crowded field, who's actually getting the most eyeballs? and by way of eyeballs, the most dollars. Well, there are several ways to look at this, and this fairly basic chart, which is the worldwide traffic to this industry across all devices in July of this year, gives us some clues in which parts to explore. So let's start with the 800-pound gorilla in the room and kind of get it out of the way. Regardless of how you cut it, regardless of the geography, country, city, whatever, YouTube reigns supreme. They have more than 10 times the number of monthly visitors as the second place provider, which is Netflix, and YouTube dwarfs everyone else. I do want to call out that their business model is very different from the rest of the brands on this list in that they don't really create original content. YouTube relies on everyone from independent content creators to major studios, and they generally operate more as a hosting and monetization service provider. But since they were the earliest mover in this industry, YouTube has really staked out a very defensible spot for Google. Where things get interesting is a little further down this top 10 chart. I'm actually going to skip Netflix for now, and I want to draw your attention to the brand in the number 3 spot. So Migu Video was new to me, and I'm supposed to be the head of industries here. And it's actually a brand new entrant to this top 10 list as of the last 2 months. It's a subsidiary of China Mobile. So unsurprisingly, 95% of their traffic is on mobile. Migu leapfrogged a dozen or so providers to land here at number 3 in the last 90 days. So how did they do it? I'm going to dive into this in a lot more detail in the next slide. The last bit I wanted to call your attention to on this slide are the brands in the 5, 6, and 7 spots. Well, despite appearances, all 3 of these providers, Disney Plus, Hotstar, which is a provider in India, and Hulu, are actually fully or partially owned by Disney. In fact, Hulu is often bundled with Disney Plus. If you actually add up all of this traffic, Disney's ranking is actually much higher in this list than it appears to be. Remember this, and we're going to dig deeper in a subsequent slide. So pivoting back to Migu for a second, how in the world did a company with less than 60 million visits in May grow 10 times in 2 months? Well, we actually know the answer to this because we're able to observe trends over time, and we had directional insights from search on what happened. As you might remember, I mentioned that Migu is owned by China Mobile, and through that ownership, Migu sublicensed the rights to stream both the Euros and the Olympics in China. Both of these events actually turned out to be incredibly popular with mobile users in that country. In fact, the Olympics in China were so popular that 4 out of 5 top newly discovered global search terms for June and July were all variations of the words Olympics in Chinese. What this means is when we looked at worldwide search traffic, China search basically dominated global search. And what they searched for was the Olympics. MiguVideo.com was the traffic leader for 3 of those search terms. Migu has since then signed deals to stream the Beijing 2022 Olympics and the Qatar 2022 FIFA World Cup. In addition to that, they've scored rights to stream games from the Asian Football Confederation, the Chinese Basketball Association, and they've got a deal with the NBA to stream NBA games. Of all the brands that are in the global top 10, Migu is the only one that has actually successfully consolidated sports streaming, and they were able to do it in 3 months. For other sports brands and leagues that have an ambition to grow their streaming products, this could be a brand to monitor, even though we know that the country dynamics in China may differ from the dynamics in the UK or in France or in the US. But again, I mean, the fact that they were able to do this so quickly is surprising and definitely something to continue to keep an eye on. If we add together traffic from Disney Plus, Hulu, and Hotstar, Disney would actually replace Migu as the number 3 streaming provider after Netflix, with 900 million global visits in July. If we include ESPN Plus, it's a platform that's frequently bundled with Disney and Hulu. This would bring July visits to nearly 1 billion. Disney Plus and Hulu are household names, but Hotstar is actually a leading platform in and of itself in India and Southeast Asia. Disney acquired them in 2019, and it's since seen explosive growth in the region, especially once it started distributing Disney's library in 2022. Disney Plus and Hulu, which are both heavily weighted towards desktop, have roughly equal distribution of men and women and have roughly the same age distribution between these platforms. But when you look at Hotstar, their audience is primarily on mobile, and it's really men between the ages of 25 to 44 that make up the bulk of their users. This is a really interesting dynamic and observation that we saw when we were looking at, again, the state of streaming. While Netflix continues to dominate, Disney is making moves and they're leveraging the power of their original content library that they've amassed through a series of acquisitions, everything from Marvel to Star Wars. And it's using this to build a defensible market position in many geographies. So bringing this back to Netflix, I wanted to wrap up this section of the presentation with a quick rundown on Netflix and Amazon. A lot has already been said and written about these brands by other folks, and our data actually reflects a lot of the same. When COVID hit, Netflix and most other streaming platforms saw a COVID-driven bump. It does appear that once lockdowns and restrictions eased, Netflix traffic is down slightly in 2021 compared to the same period in 2022. But in the next section, I'm going to do a deeper look into whether this is impacting their actual subscriptions and revenue. As for Amazon, they own both the IMDb and Prime Video domains. IMDb is categorized as a streaming service because they do stream ad-supported content on IMDb TV, but their traffic figures are actually a bit misleading as we dig a little bit deeper. Because the core of their business is more about entertainment, movies, and rankings content, written content. Amazon predominantly streams through Prime Video, and this is interesting because their user base has to have a Prime subscription to access the content. That means that the purchase drivers for Prime Video's audiences might be pretty different from the other pure play streaming brands in this space, since there's a lot of other Prime benefits that are bundled with Amazon, especially during COVID. I mean, if you think about free grocery delivery from Whole Foods, I mean, it's really hard to basically separate that out. And as a result, any bump in traffic due to COVID seems to be holding steady. But again, unpacking the drivers and allocating weight towards signing up for a Prime subscription to get Whole Foods groceries versus accessing Prime's content library, it's a bit complicated. On the note of COVID, it has and continues to have a massive impact on most industries, and video streaming is no exception. A year plus of pandemic has changed all of our lives in profound ways, and some of these shifts are probably permanent. When schools, offices, restaurants, movie theaters, bars, clubs, when they all shut down last March, home and work and entertainment all became intertwined. Plus you add in border closures and all travel stopped. I don't know about you, but I started to feel like I was living at work. And I think you can see that reflected in, if you look in these charts, the sharp drop in travel and ticket sales in March, which occurred at the same time as a sharp uptick in groceries and home and garden. But there's only so much banana bread one can bake before this boredom creeps up again. And as you can see in this TV and streaming industry traffic chart, we can literally visualize that step up in traffic to streaming sites for a little bit of entertainment and escapism. So where did people escape to? And how did they find the entertainment they wanted? Interestingly, when folks in the US started typing the searches into Google in March of 2020, by the way, I'm focusing now, I'm shifting now from worldwide to actually focusing on a specific country. And it's because when we dive into individual countries, we start to see slight nuances. So it's a little bit easier for this part of the presentation to focus on just one. As I was saying, when folks in the US started typing searches into Google in March of 2020, their search behaviors didn't exactly show a particularly significant need for discovery. What I mean by this is that even though these folks may not have directly typed in youtube.com into the browser, most of the folks searching here had a specific streaming brand in mind. So instead of searching for new shows or streaming, or I'm bored, what should I watch? Or even Tiger King, they had very specific branded names in mind. These folks weren't just looking for content, they were looking for content from a particular streaming provider that already had high brand recognition. And these trends are still valid today. The top 10 searches are still for brands. I suspected that the content discovery was actually done in platform. I mean, imagine your own content discovery once you actually log into Netflix or Disney Plus. Lots of scrolling, lots of searching for content categories to find that next new show to binge on or that next movie to watch. I'm calling this out because March 2020 was the month when streaming took a pretty substantial step up in the mindsets of folks looking for ways to stream video content. As new entrants enter this marketplace, that means there's a substantial branding hurdle to overcome in developing that same level of brand recognition. But once captured, the audiences tend to stick around. And sticking around is lucrative. When we look at Disney Plus, Hulu, and Netflix as pure play streaming examples, we see a substantial uptick in traffic to the sign-up pages for each of these platforms in March of 2020. By the way, we pulled this data using our segments analysis tool, which looks at URL strings that included terms like sign up on desktop browsers. We don't yet have this on mobile web, but it is something that is, I think, a differentiating feature that we have and allows us to dig a little bit deeper. With the exception of Hulu over the holidays, we aren't seeing a substantial uptick in cancellations, even with COVID restrictions easing in 2021. In fact, Netflix's cancellations have actually fallen year over year, even though overall traffic is down according to our desktop segment data. The growth in the industry, a proven track record of monetizing these platforms by subscription, and sustainability of audiences once acquired really does make this compelling for new entrants like HBO Max, Peacock, and Paramount. Think back a couple of slides to where I showed that massive acceleration of new entrants coming into this marketplace and all of the as yet to be launched platforms that are coming in the next couple of months, years. That being said, there are a finite number of hours in a day that people can dedicate to streaming video, and we're already seeing a ceiling in how many subscriptions a user is willing to sustain. For folks who are already convinced of the benefits of streaming, they've already proven their loyalty to a handful of brands. In the top chart here, I've picked 3 of the more established brands, Netflix, Disney, and Hulu, and 2 newer entrants, HBO Max and Peacock, in the US, just for the sake of comparison. Again, this is desktop only data, but I want to call out that out of the almost 60% of people who visit Netflix, only visit Netflix. And very few will actually visit more than 3 streaming websites. Newer entrants are going to need to either differentiate themselves enough to open up a new market of folks who never would have considered a subscription to streaming before, or they're going to need to find a way to wrestle away the audiences that are already proving to be pretty loyal, that are subscribed to a handful of entrenched brands. Year to date, we're seeing this play out with the audience behaviors between the entrenched users of Netflix, Disney Plus, and Hulu. And we basically compare that to the new entrants, HBO Max and Peacock. If you look at the bottom chart here, 50% of HBO Max and Peacock's audiences are already visiting a mix of these 3 entrenched providers. With that said, I hope it's a little clearer now how important it is for brands in the streaming services in this space to protect their positions. The original exclusive content and IP are the differentiators in this increasingly crowded space. And what that means is that, piracy, which was once seen as a negligible cost of doing business, is now expected to cost the industry upwards of over $50 billion in 2022. And that doesn't even include sports streamings. The barriers to illegally redeploying content are lower than ever. We've gone from burning a couple of DVDs and selling them maybe on the street corner or giving them to our friends to a sophisticated multi-device and global phenomenon. And the reach of piracy is now global. So how do brands go about protecting their content if the barriers to entry are lower than ever? Which mole in this game of whack-a-mole should brands whack? This illustration here gets at the steps a brand can take to protect themselves. Similarweb's global reach is actually a huge benefit to some of our customers today that use us to make that determination. And that happens in 3 steps. Step 1, find the suspicious activity and keep an eye on new entrants. One way to do that is to look at search activity for terms that include words like torrent, um, or terms like fill in the blank, new content, new show, and free. Step 2 is qualify those domains. One way to do this is to look at potentially suspicious sites and look at where their traffic is coming from relative to the industry benchmark, and then monitor that domain's traffic trends to see if they all of a sudden skyrocket. Based on that, you can make a determination on whether it's worth the effort to deploy a brand's limited anti-piracy resources to go after a particular site. And step 3, once a brand has successfully deployed their lawyers, continue to monitor traffic and engagement patterns for those suspicious domains to make sure that those legal efforts are actually working. In Similarweb, our customers today can actually create dashboards to do this, and they can also use our API to automate this. If there's more interest in diving into this, I'm actually going to direct you to a white paper that we just published as a companion piece to this webinar that has a lot more detail. The reason why I'm not actually showing those slides here is that you can then take this white paper as sort of a takeaway from this to study in a little bit more detail. Yara, do you mind actually dropping that clickable link into the Zoom chat for anyone that's interested? So that actually brings us to the end of the prepared remarks I had for this webinar today, short and sweet. I'm going to open up the floor for questions. I'll do my best to answer them, but I hope you found this interesting and helpful. Yara, I don't know if we had any questions coming through in Q&A. If there aren't any questions, then we might wrap this up and everyone can have 30 minutes back in their day. If there is anything that comes after, Yara is going to be sending out a follow-up to this, including a link to this recorded webinar, as well as any of the questions or any of the curiosity that you guys may have in terms of the anti-piracy sequence and the details of how we would go about helping with that. Okay, if that's all, then let's wrap this up. Enjoy the rest of your week, and hopefully I'll talk to some of you soon. Take care. Oh, whoops, I just saw a question come in. Any insights on which platform has... Sorry, do you mind clarifying this question by what you mean by insights and which platform has created the most content? Does this mean in terms of like which one of these platforms, these streaming services, has the most original content, or... Got it. So one thing that Similarweb does not have visibility into, unfortunately, is the searches that are happening within each of these content providers. I think also one thing to note is that these streaming providers don't all just have original content within their platforms. They also license from others. Like as an example, Netflix and Amazon Prime will license content and shows that the BBC creates, and will host them within their system. So it's really hard to actually quantify that and even define that. I mean, I'm just gonna go back to the original definition where no one seems to be able to agree on a common definition of what streaming even means. The other, I think, complexity of measuring that is that depending on which country you're in, different shows and different content is available depending on the interest. I mean, if you think about the number of languages in which shows are created and hosted, it makes it even more difficult to actually quantify that. Totally agree that that information would be good to have as you look at the competition between the platforms and the offers. I think that's where the original content and the acceleration of some of these the acceleration of the launch of these platforms that's really building protected, or sorry, the acceleration of these platforms is becoming more important to actually protect the content that they do have, to make sure that they're keeping those audiences when they are able to successfully compete. In terms of the streams, that's not something that Similarweb does measure right now. This is something that's more so looking at general traffic trends, and how people are searching and engaging with some of these streaming platforms today. Um, but that is something that, I can definitely take that question around streaming KPI, and bring it back to our product teams to see if that is something that we can eventually start to incorporate into our product. Yep, exactly. Netflix is spending billions of dollars of content, which is likely not sustainable down the line. But again, they've got a very defensible position right now. They've got a ton of brand recognition, and based on search, I mean, after YouTube, Netflix is the platform that people are thinking about, that they're top of mind when they are looking for a new subscription. Um, Great. So I am going to actually close the webinar because it looks like we've got several folks that have since dropped off. Thank you for having these come in. If there are any additional questions that come through after the fact, I'll make sure to wrap this up and respond to those, or just send you guys those answers when we actually send up the follow-up email.